Thank you all for your practice. And so what we did there is essentially we began with just a kind of a global mindfulness practice, bringing mindfulness to the body. And then we moved into what is called a shamatha practice, which is a single-pointed focus practice. Sometimes they call it mindfulness of breathing, but mindfulness of breathing is really more of an anapanasati practice when we observe different stages of breathing. We observe the quality of the breath, the length of the breath, and samatha is more just single-pointed attention. Just for some clarification for people who are interested in that kind of nerdy stuff. Tonight, what I would like to talk about is just to give a general overview of the Eightfold Path laid out by the Buddha. The Buddha said that the Eightfold Path is the path to the cessation of suffering. It's the path to peace, wisdom, and liberation from the cycle of birth and death, otherwise known as samsara. What I've found is it's not really so much a path, right? Like a path is like you start here, you go this way, and there's a destination at the end. For me, this is essentially a path with no destination. And it's not so much a path, because the path is pretty well worn. It's pretty easy to navigate a path. With this, what we're really looking at is, it's like kind of like being dropped at the edge of a forest with a machete and being told, like, good luck, have fun, make a way. That's been my experience anyway. So it's not so much a path. What it really is more of a map. It's a framework for things that we should give our attention to. And if you were here for I gave a talk on the Four Noble Truths a few weeks ago, and the Buddha didn't really teach cause and effect. What the Buddha taught was interdependence, right? This is dependent on that. And so like suffering is dependent on craving, and craving is ultimately dependent on suffering. And so in that vein, this Eightfold Path is kind of dependent upon the Third Noble Truth, which is the cessation of suffering. And the cessation of suffering is also dependent upon the Eightfold Path. And it's interesting the way that this is laid out because, again, the Buddha didn't teach cause and effect. So if we were to look at the Four Noble Truths, it would be, I would say that in life that there is suffering. That would be the first Noble Truth. And that the cause of that suffering is craving, which I think that craving adds to further suffering. I think it causes further suffering, but I don't think that it causes all suffering. I feel like life just contains suffering anyway, and this suffering actually creates craving for things to be different, which in turn creates more suffering because we crave for things to be different. So it's kind of like that scenario of what came first, the chicken or the egg. And in this sense, it's the same way with the cessation of suffering and the Eightfold Path. Does the Eightfold Path lead to the cessation of suffering? Absolutely it does, but you also can't really get access to the path without first letting go of reactivity, which is the Third Noble Truth. So there's this word nirodha, which means cessation. And so without the cessation of our reactivity, we are going to have a really hard time following this map and following this path. They work together. They're interdependent, as I said. Again, which came first, the chicken or the egg? It doesn't really matter because they can't work without each other. So they are completely dependent upon each other. It doesn't matter which came first because we need both of them for this to work. Bhikkhu Bodhi said that the Eightfold Path is the path to awakening. It's the path that leads us from ignorance to wisdom, from greed to generosity, and from hatred to love. And that's kind of been my experience. Like this path, this map, whatever you want to call it, has profoundly changed my life in so many different ways. I was an entirely different person 7 years ago, literally, cellularly too. But mentally and just the way that I live my life is entirely changed through following this path and this practice. Like I said, this path works as just a map of suggestions as to how we should live. These aren't commandments. They're not set in stone. They're just things that we should really give our attention to. And I feel like mindfulness is kind of the key to that, right? It's one of the path factors, and there are 7 other factors to this path, but I feel like mindfulness is really the key that opens the door to the rest of it, because without mindfulness, we can't see past our habituations. And we need mindfulness into our habituations in order to see what we need to let go of, in order to see what we need to bring us to this place of liberation. without a mindful view of our ethics, we won't have the mental freedom to get free, to get liberated, so to speak. Again, these are not commandments, they're suggestions. This is not a path of dogma. Even with the Four Noble Truths, let's get rid of that word truth. It's not capital T, truth, things to know. These are tasks to perform. So to kind of recap the teachings of that particular teaching, the Four Noble Truths, the encouragement is to embrace suffering. It's not to just say, hey, have you observed, did you notice that life is kind of hard? It's like, yeah, I've noticed that. And what do we do with that, though, right? Like we learn to embrace suffering. We learn to turn towards the suffering rather than away from it. By doing that, we can let go of the craving for things to be different than they are, which ultimately will lead us to a reduction in our reactivity, which will give us entrance into this path. There's this word in Pali, which is the language that the earliest texts were recorded in. The Buddha may have spoken, he may not have, probably not. The Pali Canon was first found in Sri Lanka, and the first iteration of it was written about 300 years after the Buddha's death. Before that, this was an oral tradition. It was passed down orally. But again, this isn't a path of dogma. There's this word, ehipassiko, and it just means come and see for yourself. And that is the encouragement, is to come and see for yourself. Like, apply these teachings to your life and see how it changes. See if it does change. See if this works for you. It has been my experience that if you apply these teachings to your life, that you will notice a change in your life. It's almost impossible to not see a change in your life. That has at least been my experience, and that is all that I can speak from. Even the Buddha in the Kalama Sutta said, believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, no matter if I've said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense. So this is a path, and this is a practice of direct experience. It's not go read the books and listen to the talks and do the things that are just, we can intellectualize this all day, but unless you actually apply it, you're not going to really notice any real change in your life. So tonight, I would like to talk about the Eightfold Path. I'd like to talk about each path factor, what the Buddha said about the path and its factors, and why there's the encouragement to cultivate this path. So in the Vibhanga Sutta, which is found in the Samyutta Nikaya, which is the linked discourses, it's Samyutta Nikaya 45.8 for all the Dharma nerds in here, which I'm probably the only one. Anyway, it begins as thus. He says, as at Savatthi, the Buddha said this. He said, bhikkhus. And bhikkhus in this context means monks. For this purpose, we're all bhikkhus. We're all people on this path. We're all studying this path. So bhikkhus, I will teach and analyze for you the Noble Eightfold Path. Listen and apply your mind well. I will speak. Yes, sir, they replied. And the Buddha said this. He said, and what is the Noble Eightfold Path? It is right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion. And what is right view? Knowing about suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. This is called right view. And what is right thought? This can also be interpreted as right intention. You'll hear right intention a lot of the time. And what is right thought? It is the thought of renunciation, of goodwill, and harmlessness. This is called right thought. And what is right speech? Avoiding speech that's false, divisive, harsh, or nonsensical. This is called right speech. And what is right action? To avoid killing living creatures, stealing, and sexual activity, sexual misconduct. You don't have to avoid sex. I'm not telling you to avoid sex. Go enjoy your life. Just be mindful of it, right? This is called right action. And what is right livelihood? This is when a noble disciple gives up wrong livelihood and earns a living by right livelihood. This is called right livelihood. And then these are a little longer here, so bear with me. And what is right effort? It's when a mendicant generates enthusiasm, tries, makes an effort, exerts the mind, and strives so that bad, unskillful qualities don't arise. They generate enthusiasm, try, make an effort, exert the mind, and strive so that bad, unskillful qualities that have arisen are given up. They generate enthusiasm, try, make an effort, exert the mind, and strive so that skillful qualities that have not arisen do arise. They generate enthusiasm, try, make an effort, exert the mind, and strive so that skillful qualities that have arisen remain, are not lost, but increase, mature, and are fulfilled by development. This is called right effort. And what is right mindfulness? This is when a mendicant meditates by observing an aspect of the body, keen, aware, and mindful, rid of covetousness and displeasure for the world. They meditate observing an object or an aspect of feelings, keen, aware, and mindful, rid of covetousness and displeasure for the world. They meditate observing an aspect of the mind, keen, aware, mindful, rid of covetousness and displeasure for the world. They meditate observing an aspect of principles, keen, aware, mindful, rid of covetousness. I'm just going to say that word about 90 times and keep flubbing it the more I say it. Covetousness and displeasure for the world. This is called right mindfulness. And we've got one more, bear with me. And then we're going to go back through them each one by one. And what is right immersion? This is also known as right concentration. It's when a mendicant, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption, which has rapture and bliss born of seclusion, while placing the mind and keeping it connected. As the placing of the mind and keeping it connected are stilled, they enter and remain in the second absorption, which has the rapture and bliss born of immersion, with internal clarity and mind at one, without placing the mind and keeping it connected. And with the fading away of rapture, they enter and remain in the third absorption, where they meditate with equanimity, mindful and aware, personally experiencing the bliss of which the noble ones declare, equanimous and mindful, one meditates in bliss. Giving up pleasure and pain and ending former happiness and sadness, they enter and remain in the fourth absorption without pleasure or pain, with pure equanimity and mindfulness. And this is called right immersion. What the hell does all that mean, right? Well, I'll give you a brief overview. What is right view? So within our meditation practice and within the Theravadan lineage, there is what is known as the progress of insight. There is what is called the four-path model. It is said that when you pass through this progress of insight 4 times, boom, awakened, party time, right? First path would be stream entry. You would become what is called a Sotapanna. And there are, again, 3 more times you have to pass through this before you actually achieve this grand awakening into whatever that is. Maybe it's non-duality. Maybe it's seeing through the illusion of existence. I'm kind of that mind. So knowing about suffering, the origin of suffering. So this is where we really just observe the Four Noble Truths again. We come back to the truth of suffering, that suffering does exist. Suffering existing on my wrist right now. I'm choosing to not suffer over it though. And that is the relinquishment. There is the cessation of suffering, right? The choice of not suffering. The pain exists. I'm choosing to not let it get to me. The cessation of suffering, again, Nirodha, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. This is called right view. So we get wisdom through this path, right? So the Eightfold Path are 8 factors that are actually broke up into 3 sections. These are Panya, Sila, and Samadhi. And now if we look at them in linear order, it starts with Panya, it starts with wisdom. But that's not really too relevant because it's kind of you start where you're at, right? In the East, in China, in Sri Lanka, Burma, all these places where Buddhism originated and still thrives, they start with Sila. Sila translates as roughly as morality or ethics. I like integrity as a translation. And this is where we start looking at the path factors of right speech, right action, right livelihood, things of that nature, which is generally where we start. And I'll explain that further later. But in numerical order, path factor 1 is right view. So we have this right view. And one way to look at this is seeing the truth of suffering and also seeing all sides of things. So we can look at the word right. Okay, we have this word right that is the precursor to every path factor. Let's get that out of there. Let's just throw that away. Because right gives the idea that you can have wrong view, which might be true, but sama, which is the actual Pali word that was used, that was translated as right, doesn't really mean right. It means something more like total or complete. So it's like having a complete worldview, not having dialectical thinking. Or dichotomous thinking. It's not looking at both things as black and white. It's looking at things as a spectrum. There's a whole range of gray in between black and white. Mm-hmm. And it's important to see other people's viewpoints in the world. It's important to not be stuck in fixed views. Like, I know things to be this way. This is the only way things are. Things are never this or that. They're always both and, generally, in my experience. So then we move to the second path factor. What is right intention or right thought, as it's put here? The thought of renunciation and goodwill and harmlessness. This is called right thought, right? Just be a good person. That's not that hard. I don't think. Hasn't been for me. I mean, maybe at one point in my life, right? Maybe when I was still choosing to suffer over things that don't need suffering added to them. Maybe then, but and renunciation, just letting go of the things that are unskillful. And this isn't saying, like, don't participate in life. I will never tell you to not participate in life. Please enjoy your life to the fullest, but know when things are affecting you in an unskillful way, when things are becoming destructive rather than constructive. That's the encouragement. And so that's the panya part of the path. Then we talk about sila again, integrity, ethics, morality. The Buddha said that sila is the foundation of the spiritual life. Without sila, one cannot progress on the path to liberation. And so this is where we find, again, these path factors of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. As far as speech is concerned, what is right speech? Avoiding speech that's false, divisive, harsh, or nonsensical. So we don't lie, right? Why don't we lie? Because it gets us in a lot of trouble most of the time, right? And it's really, I don't know if you've noticed, but when you do lie, it's really hard to keep up with all the lies. It's much easier to just be straightforward and just tell the truth. Then we don't have to try to remember all the bullshit we've been telling others and ourselves. You ever notice sometimes when you lie, you start to believe your own lies? Mm-hmm. With enough time, you start to believe your own bullshit. Divisive speech, right? Like quarreling, harsh speech, just being a jerk in general. And we can look at this in relation to others. We can also look at it in relation to ourselves. Like, how do we talk to ourselves? What is the relationship that we have with ourselves? And it's easy to think about speech in the form of verbal speech, but like with social media and all these things these days, like, that's speech too. Have you ever noticed that some people are completely different in person than they are over social media? It's like just because they're on a keyboard, it gives them carte blanche to say the worst crap in the world. It's like there's this layer of connection that's taken away. And because of that, it just causes some people to just be really cruel. You ever read the comments section on the marketplace in Pensacola? It's some of the worst stuff I've ever seen about. They're just mean. So if we're looking at right speech, like, again, how are we talking to other people? How are we talking to ourselves? Are we being kind to ourselves? Are we being harsh? Are we? The Buddha also advised against idle chatter, right? Just talking just to talk. Like, why? Why do we do that? When we could just enjoy silence. We can look at our speech through a litmus of, is it true? Is it kind? Is it timely? And is it helpful? And if it doesn't meet those qualifications, then is it really worth saying? Likely not. The next factor in the sila part of the path is right action. This is where we kind of start talking about the precepts. So within the monastic world, there's, I think, like 280 something precepts, maybe more than. I'm not up to date on my Vinaya and how many monastic precepts there are. I can tell you that as a lay practitioner, there's 5 that we generally undertake. And this is to avoid killing any living being, avoid harming any living being, to avoid taking what is not freely given, to avoid false, slanderous, or harsh speech, to avoid sexual misconduct, and to not take any intoxicants which lead to heedlessness. So basically, we don't take anything that's not freely given. We don't steal. And this isn't just limited to physical things. This can be people's time, right? Like, time is something that we can take away from people. And I'll let you in on a secret. It's the only thing we can't get any more of, which kind of sucks. We're very limited in our time. As far as sexual activity, this is sexual misconduct, right? So within the framework of the Dharma, the Buddha advised against cheating on your partner. If you're in a relationship, don't sleep with other people. If you are single, don't sleep with somebody who's in a relationship. Don't sleep with children. And don't use sex to gain something, right? Like, don't use it as a bartering tool, essentially. So no prostitution, sorry. And the way that I like to look at this, especially with the do no harm, is to do no harm to myself. And start there. It's kind of like the oxygen mask principle on the plane, right? Like, if we're doing harm to ourselves, we're inherently going to be doing harm to others. So we have to start with ourselves and then extend that outward in all directions. So just be kind to yourself. Just keep an eye on your actions. Again, these are suggestions. These are not commandments. But and then right livelihood. What do we do for a living? How do we make our living? Does what we do cause harm? And we can go down that rabbit hole for a long, long way. And whether you like it or not, what you do probably causes some harm in the world. It's hard to avoid that, unfortunately. And again, I will be going over all of these again and kind of picking them apart one by one. But and that's the sila part of the path. And from sila, then we can move into the meditation portion of the path, or the samadhi part of the path. And the reason they teach it sila first in the East is because it's really hard to sit in meditation if you've been cheating and lying and stealing and killing. I don't know about y'all, but for me, whenever I sit on the cushion and I bring my awareness inward, the first things that come up are the things that I was like, ooh, that wasn't good. That was unskillful. I probably could have done better there. So if we can just avoid doing those things in the first place, it's going to make it a whole lot easier to sit in meditation. And so with the meditation portion of the path, this samadhi part of the path, we talk about right effort. This is observing the mind, right? It's putting in the effort to do the work. It's putting in the effort to say, oh, I'm having an unskillful thought, or I'm committing an unskillful action, and then transmuting that into something skillful, to transmute the destructive into constructive. And we can kind of leave that at that. I'm not going to go read over all this again. Right mindfulness. Right mindfulness is the opposite of wrong mindfulness. I'm kidding. Right mindfulness is just, it's paying attention to certain factors of how to be mindful. And this is really found within the Satipatthana Sutta, which is kind of funny because the Eightfold Path is also found within the Satipatthana Sutta. And you can see the interdependence here again of the way that these teachings are all deeply intertwined. It's like fabric woven together. Like, you don't get a piece of fabric without all these pieces being in exactly the right place in the right spot. And so within the Satipatthana, we go over all these different factors of how to be mindful. We start with the breath and the body, and then we expand that into what's known as feeling tone, or Vedana. This is the pleasant or unpleasant, or the range in between pleasant and unpleasant of our experience. Sometimes people say neutral, but there's not really a neutral. There's, like pleasure 1 through 10, and then pain 1 through 10, and then somewhere around pleasure 1 and pain 1 is neutral, but it's never really truly neutral. You're never not feeling something. And from the feeling tone, then we move into what is known as mindfulness of chitta, or mindfulness of the mind, and these are our mental attitude towards the world. So it's how we view the world. If we're viewing the world through kind eyes, we're probably going to be viewing a kind world. If we're viewing the world through lenses of hate and aversion, we're probably going to be hateful and aversive. It's just the way it works. What you frequently think and ponder upon becomes the nature of the mind. So the more we entertain these things, you're going to become that. You know, have you ever heard, you are who you surround yourself with? Well, it's the same thing. You are what you think, right? You will become what you think frequently. And the last factor is right immersion or right concentration. Again, we could probably just get rid of the word right, because I feel like if you're in a Dharma group or in a Buddhist group, like, it's not wrong, right? We're trying to be good people here. That's the whole point, I think, of this whole path. Is like we're just trying to be good people. Right immersion and samadhi really is what this particular passage here is pointing to is it talks about absorption. So it says, it's when a mendicant, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption. And what the Buddha is referring to here is these states of jhana, or meditative absorption. And these are, you can reach these through deep concentration practice. So as we were doing the mindfulness of breathing practice, just paying attention to this samatha practice, this one point of breath, if you sit and you observe the breath and just the breath for X amount of time, I can't tell you a time because everybody is different. You will have a different experience than I will. Rusty's going to have a different experience than Alex here. Everybody's going to be a little different. But if you observe the breath, you will enter into these states of jhana, these states of meditative absorption, and I got to tell you, it's pretty cool. If you want to feel really, really good, sit and watch your breath for like 3 days. It does take about that long, quite honestly. It takes several hours a day for at least a few days, and you can reach these states of meditative absorption. At first, the more you become used to doing this, the more you practice, the more it builds, and it gets much easier to enter into these states. It doesn't take days after that. I know people who can get into these states of meditative absorption, and there are 8 jhanas. There's actually 9, but we're going to say 8 here because the 9's kind of like the big one. We'll leave that one out. But you can cycle through these pretty rapidly once you have enough practice under your belt. I'm not there yet. I was at one point, and then I took a little break for a little while, and then it's like the law of reversibility. If you don't use it, you lose it. But then there's this muscle memory involved with the mind as well. So the encouragement is to just practice, sit, meditate. It does help. And it's through our meditation practice that we come to, after we get our ethics and our integrity in line, then our meditative practice really opens up. And then that's when we kind of enter back to it circles around back to the first part of the path. That's when we gain wisdom through this path. And again, this path is not linear. I recommend you start with Sila. It's really important. Like getting your ethics in line, like making sure that you're not harming anyone, you're not stealing, you're not cheating, you're not committing any sexual misconduct. These are so important to the meditative aspect of this path, and ultimately to cultivating wisdom. But there is no real linear way to approach this path. You kind of do it all at once. It's kind of like, okay, we have to get all these things going at the same time. Because every part of this path is actually equally important. There's no part of this path that is less important than another part of this path. And it's not something that happens overnight. Like getting these path factors in line, it doesn't happen overnight. This is a process. This is the path is said to be, we need to cultivate this path. And I don't know if you've ever grown anything, if you have gardened, it takes a while to bear fruit, right? Like we can plant the seeds, but if we don't nurture the seeds and we don't take care of them, if we don't give them the right amount of nutrients and the right amount of water, then they're not going to grow. You're not going to bear fruit. So if you want to bear fruit on this path, you have to nurture each aspect of this path. Ajahn Brahm said that the Eightfold Path is not a path to be followed just for a day, a week, or a month, but for a whole lifetime. It's a way of living that brings about true happiness and peace. And again, that has been my experience. So again, Ehipassiko, come and see for yourself. Clearly, you are already here. Congratulations. Now it's time to go and do the homework forever, for the rest of your life. Doesn't that sound like a fun homework assignment? I've got homework tonight. Oh, really? And for every night, for the rest of my life. I couldn't think of a better thing to work on, though, right? Again, this path has changed my life so dramatically, and just my overall view of myself and of the world. Like, I have never been a happier person than I am in this moment right now, quite honestly. And I owe that 100% to this path. So that is the Eightfold Path in the overview. It's kind of referred to as the 3 trainings. And again, we train in Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. That's what we train in. And it does lead to liberation. Because I used to be really depressed. Like unaliving myself depressed. And that is not me anymore. Like, it is so far from me these days. And God, I really owe everything to this, quite honestly. I wouldn't be sitting up here talking to all of you about it if I didn't owe my life to this path, quite honestly. So liberation is there, right? And whatever that looks like for you. Whether it's seeing the true nature of mind and experiencing not self, which I had a kind of an insight the other day, and I feel like they're all talking about the same thing. If we look at all the Eastern religions, I think they're all talking about the same thing. Whether it's like the Vedic, it's talking about Brahman or the Godhead, or whether it's the Taoist talking about the Tao, or whether it's the Buddhist talking about not self. Like, if we're looking for the self, if we try to observe the self, anything that is observable is not us, right? Mm-hmm. So we can observe the body. I know that I am not the body because I can observe it. I can observe the mind. It means I'm not the mind. So some people say, oh, well, you're the witness. It's like, yeah, but I can also witness the witness, and I can observe the observer, and I can be conscious of consciousness. So if we get behind that, who's behind the curtain? Nobody. There's nobody there. There's nothing. Or there's everything. Because nothing and everything are the same thing. Because you can't have one without the other. You can't have light without dark. You can't have good without bad. You can't have self without other. And this is where we come to these teachings of like non-duality and things, which are a little more esoteric. And we may do some fun, weird talks on that. I've tried to keep it not esoteric at all in here, but I'm kind of leaning more that direction these days. So bear with me as we descend into madness together. Anyway, y'all want to do some more meditation? Sure. Sounds good.